Hello everyone, and welcome to the first video for chapter 34. And now chapter 34 is titled The World Today, and in this chapter we're going to be talking about a number of pressing issues that are faced by the world today. And these are largely global issues, or at least issues that will impact several countries. And the first such global issue we're going to be looking at is called globalization. So globalization is just a fancy way of saying that the world is becoming more connected, especially in terms of trade and money. It's the creation of a global economy. Now, this was a trend that started way back when, during the 1500s, with the Columbian Exchange. Hopefully, a lot of you guys remember this from last year. This was the trans-regional trade exchange that followed Christopher Columbus's voyage across the Atlantic. So after Columbus, Europe, Africa, and all of the Americas, they became directly connected by trade, and this resulted in monumental changes for all of those continents. So in many ways, globalization is just an extension of all of that from hundreds of years ago. Now, all of this is an example of this thing called economic interdependence. So interdependence, you see the inter part of it first there. That's not independence and it's not dependence. Interdependence means that nations or regions are dependent upon one another. And we're seeing this more and more throughout the world, largely due to globalization. In an interdependent world, countries depend on each other for goods, resources, and labor. And this results in a strong connection between all of the countries. You see the lines that are bouncing around, not just between Europe, North America, and Asia, but between all of the regions, including the developing world like Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And for example, the U.S. depends on China for a huge amount of our consumer products, but the companies themselves are often American-owned, which China relies on. So this interdependence, it links rich and poor countries, like I just said. An example is how Chinese oil companies are setting up shop in African nations, or how the U.S. relies on Central American agricultural products. Another example of interdependence is the growth of these things called multinational corporations. You look on the map here, and I'm sure you guys will recognize a lot of these logos. McDonald's, Dairy Queen, okay, these companies are all over the world, and that's what a multinational company is. They sell their products everywhere. So a lot of them, most of them really, are American in origin, but multinational companies come from many other regions as well. And a byproduct of this is this thing called outsourcing. Outsourcing is when a company will have all of its work done in a developing country in order to save costs and make more profit. For example, Apple products are designed in the U.S., but they're assembled in China because Apple can pay Chinese workers way less than American workers. Now, interdependence is a part of this whole global trade network. Now, to help facilitate global trade, international organizations were created in the second half of the 20th century. So really, this is all taking place after World War II. An example of an international organization is the World Bank. It works very similar to a regular bank. There's actually an even building for it in New York City for the World Bank. But instead of offering advice and stuff like that to small businesses and investors, it offers it, and as well as loans, to developing nations. Another is the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF. Similar to the World Bank, it provides economic advice and assistance, as well as encouraging economic growth throughout the world. Now, sometimes international trade is facilitated by international treaties. Now, a treaty is a binding agreement between two or more countries, such as the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. Now, the WTO includes most of the world. You look at the map here. All the green countries are members. The blue here are members, but they're part of the European Union. We'll talk more about that in a second. Yellow is observers. Don't worry technically what that means, but they're basically part of it. And red are non-members, but you look at the red countries like North Korea over here, Afghanistan, Somalia, those are very, very unstable countries. So we're looking really at like the bottom of the development ladder with some of those non-members. So the vast majority of the world, not only the developed, but also the developing world, is part of this WTO. And it tries to set up guidelines to help international trade go smoothly. Now, a more local example for us in the U.S. is this thing called NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Associations. Let me move me. And this involves us, Canada, and Mexico. It's an example of a treaty that looks to break down trade barriers, to make trade easier between the three countries that are north of South America. Now, treaties like the WTO and NAFTA, they do this by opposing this thing called protectionism. There we go. Now, protectionism is a policy where a country tries to protect its own industries by putting extra taxes, called tariffs, on foreign-made goods. A recent example of this is when President Trump, when he was in office, he wanted to protect the American steel industry. So some of our companies buy steel from Canada. He imposed a heavier tax on Canadian steel in an effort to try and get American businesses to buy American-made steel. That's protectionism. International treaties like NAFTA and the WTO, they actually oppose protectionism because protectionism hurts international trade. Now, I mentioned before when we were talking about the WTO, the EU. Let's take a look at that. So the EU is a classic example of international interdependence. Let me move down here. It was formed in 1993, and the original 15 members you can see up here, all of which were from Western Europe, and most are NATO members. Remember, we talked about NATO in previous chapters. It was a military alliance made after World War II. But by the early 2000s, more than a dozen more European countries had entered into it. So you look here, there are a couple of holdouts such as Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland. And the big one to make note of here is, oops, I don't know why we didn't use the pen there. But anyway, the UK. You can see how the UK is that kind of pink shaded one, recently departed with Brexit. But we'll learn more about Brexit at a later time. And a lot of these countries that came in later were Eastern European countries, part of the old Soviet bloc. They were former communist countries. Now, the purpose of the EU, so let's bring it back to the point that was just raised before, is to promote capital, the flow, of capital, services, and products among European nations. Now, an important step in promoting trade and travel are the creation of EU passports and the euro. So citizens of the EU, you look at all these different passports here, while they'll have specific covers depending on what country they're from, it allows you to travel freely throughout the EU. So if you were to travel from Ireland to Spain, you wouldn't need to go through international customs the way we would if you flew from the United States, or even if you go from the US to Canada. Most of these nations on the continent actually have open borders, so you could drive from Spain all the way to Poland without having to go through any type of checkpoint and show documentation. It would be like traveling across the United States. And the euro, you look at the picture here of all of the money there, that became the common currency for most of Western Europe by 2002. And this has all allowed the EU to act as a single economic entity and compete with the US and China. So when they rank the economies of the world by size, very often you'll see the top two are always the United States and China, and then the EU, which is all of these countries combined, gets listed as a single entity. Now, the last thing I want to do for this video is take a look at the pros and cons of globalization. First, the benefits. One is that it provides a greater variety for consumers. Let me just give me a little bit more. There we go. Now, this is true for everything from Japanese cars to the huge variety of products in a supermarket, like you see in the picture. While most of the products in the supermarket are made by American companies, the agricultural resources used to make them come from all over the world. And this variety breeds competition, and competition lowers prices. And that's just basic capitalism. It also leads to a higher quality of products, most of the time at least. And another benefit is the growth of technology and communication. Improvements in technology and communication help companies make money with trade, so it often results in technological improvements. And lastly, studies have shown that it can, not always, but it can lead to democracy. Free trade means dealing with people from all over the world, sometimes from countries that offer more democratic freedoms than others. And these ideas can spread through trade, and this is a classic example of cultural diffusion. So while there are some very impressive benefits, globalization also has its drawbacks as well. And the most common criticism levied against globalization is that it leads to the exploitation of poor nations by the wealthy ones. Outsourcing is an example that we discussed earlier. Critics of globalization, they also feel that it puts too much pressure on poor countries to meet trade demands with rich countries, which then forces them to specialize in a small number of products that can make them money. Very similar to what we talked about in the previous chapter with the Latin American dependence on imports. Now, this in turn hurts their efforts at this thing called sustainability. Sustainability is the ability of a country to fully meet the needs of its people now without hurting their ability to do so in the future. Developing nations that just focus on exporting one product that can make them money For instance, like the way Indonesia focuses on palm oil because it gets used in products all over the world. This actually has the potential to hurt them in the long run because it makes it harder for them to create a fully developed economy in the future. Now, one last drawback is the threat of a global economic crisis. Now, because we're all connected, when a large economy like the US is struggling, it can lead to economic struggles throughout the world. A perfect example is happening right now with the current economic crisis as a result of COVID-19. Businesses in China, the US, and Europe, they all had to shut down at different times, and some are still currently shut down, and this leads to long-lasting negative impacts in the global supply chain. So that is a very, very basic overview of globalization, and then we'll get into some of the more threatening issues facing the globe in the next video.